Hi, welcome to my kitchen. So you heard us talking about pie and that the young mill girls and the young mill women would use eat pie for breakfast. So we thought we would make a pie today. And we also talked about Lydia Maria Child and her recipe. So she had a book called The Frugal Housewife. So I wanted to read you her recipe. This is what her says. When you make apple pies, stew your apples very little indeed. Just strike them through to make them tender. Some people do not stew them at all, but cut them up in very thin slices and lay them flat in the crust. Pies made in this way may retain more of the spirit of the apple, but I do not think the season mixes in as well. Put in sugar to your taste. It's impossible to make a precise rule because apples vary so much in acidity. A very little salt and a small piece of butter in each pie makes them richer. Cloves and cinnamon are both suitable spice. Lemon brandy and rose water are both excellent. A wine glass full of each is sufficient for 3 or 4 pies. If your apples lack spirit, grate lemon. So
okay.
The recipe we're going to go by, Allison. You want to help me out here?
I do. So Denise, you're an excellent cook. I am very much of a boarding house era style homemaker, wherein I do not use the kitchen very much. What you described to me feels more like a blog entry than a recipe.
So I decided that I would practice this before, our conversation, so that I could come up with the recipe that we posted. It took a few tries to get from Lydia's story to this actual recipe. I like to say that I am a good cook and that I have been a good cook for a number of years. I had some very good teachers. But baking was just always a struggle for me. And so I have been trying to, in the last couple of years, but really especially during this pandemic, it was somewhat easy to figure out what she was saying and somewhat difficult. Because she is her book is The Frugal Housewife, Lydia Maria Child believes that you could make a pie with a ratio of 1 to 2 butter to flour. So because she needs to be a little frugal with the butter, and also butter was a little more available than lard, which would also have been used at the time. So what we have here is 1 pound of stone ground whole wheat flour. And so 1 pound comes out to be about a scant 3 cups, and a very fluffy 3 cups, so not packed, but a scant fluffy 3 cups. And then we're going to add to that a 1/2 pound of salted butter. So we don't use salted butter much in right now. We tend to really use unsalted butter, especially in baking, because then you have control over the salt that you add. I've learned this at the Mary Berry School of Baking. You can attend that school too,
I might, or I might just read Lydia Maria Child. I might go more to her fiction section than her recipes.
So I was reading about her, and some of her novels sound so interesting. I think I really do want to, especially like the one she wrote, one about women. Boston during the colonial era before the revolution, and how that might affect their life, and that they could kind of have the power to participate in civic government.
Like you're saying, these books, this is a very small domestic cookery book from a little bit earlier. They don't really have a lot of numbers. It's really so if you're someone who's used to learning how to bake something from the back of a box, this is completely different. It's more like tools to understand how to bake and how to cook than exact directions.
Yeah. So all I'm doing here, and so this honestly is the truth. I learned this, but very and a lot of YouTube videos. Kind of squeeze in the butter into the flour, and I'm gonna do that so there's no big clumps left.
Now, the recipe that you listed had a lot more about the apples. And so someone like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, where would she get apples for her pie?
I would think that Elizabeth, someone of her means and the stature that she had in society, she probably had her own apple trees. She probably had a number of different fruit trees in her yard over there on Washington Street. One story that we know about, she lived right on the edge of the immigrant community here in Seneca Falls. And she was actually pretty close with a lot of the Irish immigrant women here. And, she would often be called, for a domestic dispute, to be honest. And oftentimes also she was called to their house to help them deliver their babies.
Oh, wow.
But so one of the things that she did do, because she did live right on the outskirts of the immigrant community, she would let the young kids in the neighborhood come and pick fruit off her trees. And so this seems to be coming together. Then we just add the water, all the short crust. So it's just butter, flour, and water and salt, but the salt is in the flour. So water, we're going to use just about a cup of ice water. And it took me a few tries to figure out how much water, because she's frugal. She didn't write her cookbook for Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
No.
For the women who worked in Elizabeth Cady Stanton's house. But also for a lot of women just around the country who really didn't even have the means. She wanted to make sure that they had access to these ideas and methods that she was promoting.
Okay, so I see our crust starting to form. What's going to happen next?
So now this is, another new trick that I've learned. So just know that I am not a pro. So you make a well in the middle. You see the well? So you make a well in the middle.
Yeah.
And then you put the water in there. So I'm using 1/3 of a cup at a time without an ice cube. So I'm going to put 1/3 of a cup into the well at a time. And then I'm just going to put my fingers on the outside of the bowl and kind of go up underneath that well of water and just kind of fluff around so that the water kind of gets in and mixes in with the butter and the flour there. So we're going to use just about a cup of water. I think I just said that. So we're going to use just about a cup of water. I'm going to do 2 full thirds and then a little less. What's a quarter, a quarter, a quarter, and an eighth? Is it 7/8?
That's 7/8, yeah.
My sister, the math teacher, would be so proud. Right?
Well, people like Stanton, as part of their movement for women's education, would argue that in some ways there's no better way to learn math than through cooking or to reinforce math skills through cooking. I didn't learn math that way, but maybe I'd be a better cook or mathematician.
Very good idea. She was a really large, outspoken advocate for women's education. And not just academic education. She was very outspoken and a very large proponent of physical education for women. As far as parenting goes, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was very, very, very ahead of her time. She believed that even children had the right to reason and make decisions, and she would let them do as such. There's this one funny story about her son having a piano lesson, and the piano teacher comes to teach him piano, and he wanted to go outside, and so she let him go outside, and said, yeah, he has a mind of his own. He'll make the right decision. And the piano teacher was He's not going to make the right decision. He's a boy,
No.
right? Right? Who wouldn't? So, but way ahead of her time. So it seems to be just coming together. And again, I am no pro here. I am, for those of you who are watching, I am learning with you. Believe me when I tell you. So I'm just going to put a little bit of flour on there. Now just take this into a bowl. And if we need at this point, if and when we might need a little bit more water, I do it, I just like my hands right into the bowl of water and do it that way. So that way you're not getting too much water. And you want to knead this, but really just a little bit. You don't, it doesn't really need to be kneaded too much. And because, you know, as Lydia says, you know, this is on the frugal side, right? So she's using, you know, half the amount of butter as she is flour. So it is going to be a little bit on the drier side. In one of my, and also because this is whole wheat, stone ground wheat, which is what would have been available at that time. Did you know, Allison, we are both on canals, right? So you're on a canal, I'm on a canal here in Seneca Falls. The Cayuga-Seneca Canal is part of the Erie Canal system. And until the Erie Canal opened in 1825, in New England, we had to supplement the wheat flour with rye. And then once the Erie Canal opened, and this area, Western New York, was like at that point considered like a breadbasket where all the flour was grown. Let's get this cut in half and we'll start rolling it out.
Nice.
It does make a little bit more than you need for a crust, for a two crust pie, but better to have too much than not enough. Right?
Yeah, I was so surprised when we were looking through cookbooks together how many pies people were making with meat. You know, all kinds of meat and oysters, and like they would put anything in a pie.
Yeah, so wasn't it in Lydia Maria Child's book that she, what kind of oysters were they? Pickled oysters? A pickled oyster pie? Is that?
Too many kinds of oysters, I think.
Well, also, you know, very probably more typical in New England than out this way, right? Which everybody who is watching with us can probably tell I am a native New Englander just from my speak.
That was something that Mill Girls talked about a lot, which was becoming sort of cityfied, which was losing your accent, especially women from very rural parts of New Hampshire and Vermont. They would go home and then they would talk differently, and people in their communities, you know, would not always respond so well to that, you know, that they went and kind of changed the way that they spoke based on this new place where they're living. But you know, I think a lot of people can relate to that. You want to fit in or you want to adapt something, and then it's hard to go back.
Yeah, wow. That is kind of interesting. I mean, do you think that I will end up having a Central Western New York accent if I stay here long enough?
I think so. I think so. That looks really good.
Does it? So
it does.
The pan I'm using, the pie plate, I mean,
yeah.
This pie plate belonged to my aunt. But in studying about the pies from the 19th century, I help from you. Couldn't figure out what kind of a pie plate they would use. So they would use a pie plate that was similar to this, but it would be a little bit thicker, right? A little bit taller. But about this width, you think? This is the biggest pie plate I own. And I have probably 4 or 5. So this is the biggest one I own. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to just poke some fork holes in the bottom. And then I'm going to put this wash on. You know, now we would use extract, right? So the first one that I didn't add this. And you could definitely tell in the tasting. So I wanted to make sure I added it. But I didn't have rose water. So I put in here, this is lemon juice, lemon zest. So it is 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, 1 teaspoon of lemon zest, 2 tablespoons of melted butter, and an egg yolk.
Nice.
And to kind of add the rose water kind of additive to that, I kind of made my own water. So I took a half a cup of water. I added 3/4 of a teaspoon, a whole teaspoon of vanilla extract and 1/4 of a teaspoon of almond extract.
Nice.
And the reason I added the almond is because, you know, almond extract has this like huge flavor, but vanilla is like really, you know, balanced, and I do like the two together. Okay, so here is our bottom crust. So we're going to add the apples now. So I have just about 9, this is 10 Macintosh apples that are peeled and cut and cored. In here, I have a half a cup of sugar, a teaspoon and a half of cinnamon, and 1/8 of a teaspoon of clove, ground clove. So I'm going to mix, so I'm going to mix that in with the apples and then put that on the top. So our oven is on 400, and we are going to cook this in a 400-degree oven for 40 to 45 minutes. So I'm gonna say, like, just, you know, keep an eye on your stove. You definitely have to make this, Allison.
I do.
My next trip home, we're gonna have pie. We are gonna have pie, Allison.
So where did you get those apples, and kind of what made you choose Macintosh for this project?
I found out that so very many of the apples that we eat today weren't even around in the middle of the 19th century. But Macintosh were, and they grew here. So there's kind of a, and they also grew in New England. So my thought was, what kind of apples might Elizabeth Cady Stanton have had in her orchard? And I came across a couple that I thought would be Rome apples, and Macintosh apples. So that's a lot of apples, right? So that's like 9.
Yeah.
This is going to be a tall pie. It is going to be a tall pie. So.
Now, something you said to me before was so interesting was about sugar, and where you would get your sugar from in Stanton's time was something so political for people, largely because of its connection to the slave trade. So can you tell us how people in Seneca Falls were making choices about that in, 1840s or 1850s?
We have 2 people in our story here at Women's Rights, Mary Ann and Thomas McClintock. They ran a store over in Waterloo. And before they came to this area, they were in Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, they started Philadelphia Free Produce Society. And what that meant was that they did not sell or support any product that was created with slave labor. And they continued that tradition. Came here. There were a couple of alternatives. Honey was an alternative, but also maple sugar was a real alternative, both in central Western New York and in New England.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's believed that that the French women, just north of me here, were taught how to um, make maple syrup and maple sugar from the Haudenosaunee women who lived in this area before white settlers. My little mat here that I rolling around. Um, I bet Lydia Maria Child and Elizabeth Cady Stanton's domestic have a fix for that.
In some ways, because you're really wanting to learn, right? Not just to make one thing. Like these recipes are better for you because it's teaching you ways to think about it versus, just how to get it done. Like such a total shift.
Yeah, this is going to sound really funny. My mother is an amazing baker, right? And growing up, she would bake all the time, and I would watch her. And then as I became, a young woman and was a young mother, and I would try to bake, and it would be terrible. But my mom, really did. She really did employ some of those beliefs. It's a 2-to-1. It's about the ratios, and she understands that much. But I am coming in my learning process. I am coming to those understandings that is really a big part of it. It's not really just about following the directions of a recipe like in cooking, which I don't do that either very well. How much, how much parsley do you put in your sauce? Well, it's this much, that's kind of how I do it. So I'm going to use my trusty scissors, my kitchen shears, as they're called, to cut around this. So this is just a little bit of the extra.
That pie is huge.
Isn't it?
I think it is. I think it would be good to like fuel your day in the factory, which is where I am now.
Oh, and you had mentioned that before, that, it was a very heavy kind of, diet, right? Okay, so
yeah.
I'm going to do my ugly crimping.
I mean, we would use really different words than they would, in the 1840s, but to use kind of our nutrition language today, very carb heavy carbohydrates, very much heavy in starch, and really giving women heavy, dense caloric meals before they go to work, and then, not snacking in between, not kind of these little bites, and eating a pretty serious meal in the middle of the day to really kind of keep you going for 14 hours.
In the summer, we can put in some long hours in the Park Service, and it's a lot of fun, right? It's a whole different world than what those women were going through. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and, and the women's movement. I mean, she's working in the home, out of the home. She's kind of doing all of that. She must have been exhausted.
And food just was not, necessarily readily available to people the way that it is today. Like, taking money even out of the equation, the way that you can walk through a downtown and buy lunch. The boarding house keepers in early Lowell were forbidden from having people just come in and get meals. And some of them did it anyway. But for the most part, you or someone you had a close relationship with was responsible for really feeding you outside of taverns. And 200 years later, our world is so completely different.
So we talked earlier about, the people who cooked for all of these women, and what was their life like?
Hard. Hard, yeah.
Because they would be up and have breakfast ready, for all of those women, right? All of those girls, which we know were a lot, right? You said how many hundred? A couple hundred, right?
So the complex where we recorded our first portion, the unit that I was in would have between 25 and 40 women, depending. And then if you were a widower who had children and ran a boarding house, you'd have your own family to feed. But you could easily be feeding 40, 50 people 3 meals a day. And, of course, they don't have a lot of the shortcuts that we have today. And in the 1840s and 1850s, a lot of the manufacturers who were making stoves really kept telling women that they were more efficient, they were faster, they were easier. And women across the board said, no, they're not. And, you know, historians of technology have studied these changes and shown that they were more labor intensive in some ways. And the learning curve was so stark because a lot of what you might have learned as a young person no longer translated with these new stoves. So it's a lot to really kind of take in all at once, and it's very hard work.
Well, it kind of makes sense now that Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, when she said, you know, she didn't really blame these young women for wanting to do more than, you know, circle around the stove all day. Okay, I think we're just about done here.
I like it.
I'm gonna cut a little more off over here. Okay, so let me know what you think.
I think it looks great.
It is gigantic, isn't it?
It is. It's a huge pie.
Oh my God. And you know I'm not going to get away with not making one of these for Thanksgiving now.
No, no, absolutely not. That's beautiful.
Yeah. Oh, we got to put a little bit of this wash, my vanilla, almond, butter, egg wash,
I love it.
and lemon on our little pretty apples. Because I think that Lydia would have, she's frugal, right? So she would have used everything that she could use. And so if there's extra, she's going to find something to do with that, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So my mom used to take all that and roll it out and put cinnamon and sugar in it and roll it up. And so I did that with the very first ones that I made, and it was dry. Let's but I thought, wow, if I was going to put anything in this, because this is a really rich, nutty wheat, right? It has a lot of flavor. But wow, if I was going to put anything in this, in the crust itself, I would probably put cinnamon in it. I think that would be like just a great addition.
Yes.
I don't know if anyone's ever put, you know, cinnamon in pie crust, but all right, well, let's get this in the oven, and then we'll pause for
I love it.
or so, and we'll come back and see what it looks like. Well, 40 minutes.
Awesome.
Let's get this in. Oh, it looks like our pie is done. Let's see.
Careful, it's hot.
It is hot. Oh, hot and steamy. Oh, look at this, Allison.
That looks great.
Yeah, isn't it? Woo! So
That looks awesome.
let's take this and cut it. What do you think? Let's put it down.
I like it.
Down. We can take it. We can take it into the dining room and cut it. And
Perfect.
conversation with our virtual visitors here, and we can do some question and answer. What do you think?
I can't wait to hear everybody's questions.
Oh, I'm so excited. I hope they don't ask me like really, you know, like baking questions. But we're happy to talk about Women's Rights National Historical Park and your story at Lowell National Historical Park, and share the connections that they had with food and how they used food to, you know, move through life.
Absolutely. I can't wait to hear them.
I'm pretty excited. Let's go
Me too.
cut this pie open.